James. All right. Test. We're good. Okay. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. So we're in Micah chapter 3. We left off around verse 8 last week, so we'll pick back up there. So in chapters 2 and 3, Micah is addressing three different groups of people that he considers to be the problem in Judah. The first group were the the wealthy in Judah, and they're oppressing the poor people by basically extorting them or taking their land from them. Then he talks about the leadership of Judah, and condemns them for their actions. And then he finally talks about the false prophet, or the prophets who are prophesying falsely, or they're lying to the people. And that's kind of where we left off last week. So with that in mind, he then kind of responds to them in verse 8 of chapter 3. We covered this briefly right at the end of class, but we'll pick back up with it. So in verse 8, Micah says, "But I am full of power by the Spirit of the Lord." And this is the only time in the Old Testament where one of God's people says that they're filled by the Spirit of the Lord. And so he's saying that in contrast to the false prophets who do not have the Spirit of God and who are not receiving messages from God, he's saying he actually does have the Spirit of God in him. And then we're going to see what is the Spirit of God helping him do, which is the next line. It says he's full of justice and might. So in chapter 2, he accused the wealthy as well as the leaders of not executing justice. So they're taking advantage of the poor people. They are accepting bribes and so forth. So they are not executing justice. But he says that he is full of justice because he has the Holy Spirit within him. And then he also says that he has might. Okay, and that word for might is what you might use for like a military term for a soldier or somebody who has the strength and the will to go out and fight in a battle. So what is Micah saying with these two lines? He's saying that regardless of how bad it is and how much opposition he has, he is going to stand up and fight, and he is going to stand up and confront these people, and he's going to stand for justice. And he can do that because God is giving him the strength through the Holy Spirit to do so. And then he says that he's going to declare to Jacob his transgression and to Israel his sin. So Micah, as the prophet, is going to confront the people for their sin and their transgressions. And he's basically saying he's not going to back down from them. So now he's going to address the people again. In verse 9, it says, "Now hear this, you heads of the house of Jacob and rulers of the house of Israel." So he's addressing the leaders. These would be the wealthy people as well as the leaders, the two of the three groups that he just got through ridiculing in chapter 2. And he says, "Who abhor justice and pervert all equity." And so notice he just said that he is standing for justice through the Holy Spirit, but these two groups of people, they hate justice, okay? So why do they hate justice? Because that would prevent them from accumulating wealth in the manner that they're doing it. Not that they couldn't still be wealthy, but the way they're going about it is wrong. And so they hate justice because it would prevent them from doing the things that they want to do. Not only do they hate justice, but they pervert all equity, or the ESV says they make crooked all that is straight. In other words, their mind has become so warped that anything that is good they think is bad, and vice versa. So they have strayed so far from God's will that the things that are right they think are wrong. Okay, And so he's just chastising them for their lack of justice and for their lack of willingness to do God's will. Verse 10, he says, who build up Zion with bloodshed and Jerusalem with iniquity, so that all of their wealth and all the things that they're gaining is at the expense of their fellow Judeans by taking advantage of them. Verse 11, her heads judge for a bribe. Her priests teach for pay, and her prophets divine for money. So again, he hits all three of these groups again. And he says that the leadership, or the heads, they judge for a bribe. So the people who should be executing justice are accepting bribes to rule incorrectly. So they'll rule in the favor of the guilty party and rule against the innocent party based on the fact that they're receiving a bribe. And then he says the priests teach for pay. In other words, the priests are not telling the people what the people need to hear, okay? So they're telling the people what they are paid to say, okay? And so anytime you have a group of clergy that is not teaching the truth but being paid to say something, then obviously you're going to have the people, their morality is going to go down because they're trusting on them to tell them the truth, and they're not. And then it says, and her prophets divine for money. So again, these are the false prophets. Perhaps some of them used to be true prophets, but they have gone astray, and they are telling the people what they want to hear in exchange for money, okay? And so that's, sadly, these things still happen today where people give a message that they know the people want to hear in hopes that will bring them more income. And so this kind of thing has been happening for a long time. But so he hits these same three groups of people again. So the leadership, the priests, and the prophets. All of them are being bought off to say what they think the people want to hear. So then it says, yet they lean on the Lord and say, is not the Lord among us? No harm can come to us, or come upon us. And what he's talking about here, this is a false assumption that the people made. Okay, so they thought that because they had built a temple for God in Jerusalem, that God lived in the temple. And though that is partly true, it is not exclusively true. Okay, so they thought that God basically exclusively lived in the temple. And since he lived in the temple, he would not let anything bad happen to Jerusalem, the temple, or the people, okay? Now, we all know that God does not exclusively live in a building, all right? But that was not the way they understood it at the time. And so they thought as long as God lived there in the temple that they were safe. And it didn't really matter if they completely obeyed the law correctly. They thought they were going to be fine because God had made promises to them in the past. But all those promises were predicated on the fact that they would keep the covenant, okay? And they are not keeping the covenant, so God is not obligated to keep up his end of the deal. And so this is a false understanding that they have, that they think that they can just sit back and act however they wish, and God will take care of them. So what's going to happen? So verse 12, therefore, because of you, and who is the you? The you is the bad leadership, okay? The wealthy people, the leaders, whether that's the king or the other people in control, or the false prophets, because of bad leadership, what's going to happen? It says, Zion shall be plowed like a field. If you'll remember from chapter 1, it talked about how Samaria was going to be plowed, which Samaria is the capital of Israel. Now he's talking about Zion, and we'll talk just a little bit more in a second about what Zion is. Zion shall be plowed like a field, Jerusalem shall become heaps of ruins, and the mountains of the temple like the bare hills of the forest. So in other words, he's just saying that the city is going to be destroyed, okay? I think I'll say one thing to talk about in a minute because he's going to come back to it. But Zion, well, I'll go ahead and tell you now. So Zion originally is a specific hill in Jerusalem, and so he may be addressing that, and that may be why he's saying Zion in one place and Jerusalem in the other. But generally speaking, they're synonyms. But Zion technically is the original hill that the Jebusite fortress was on, okay? And then they built, so if you remember when the people came into Canaan, they took a lot of the country over, but they didn't take Jerusalem over for a long time. In fact, Jerusalem was not captured until David captured it about 400 years after they had entered the Promised Land. So Jerusalem, for a long time, still was occupied by Canaanites, or a group of Canaanites called the Jebusites. And so their fortress was on a particular part of the city called Zion, or that's what's referred to as Zion. But he's probably using Zion and Jerusalem here as synonyms, so that's, you can just view it as all the same thing. All right, so what is he saying? He's saying that disaster is coming. Why? Because of bad leadership. Bad leadership has brought the country down. It has led the people to disobeying the covenant. And as a result of that, God is going to come in and allow them to be destroyed, just like Samaria was taken over before. And that's the end of chapter 3. Does anybody have any questions on chapter 3? Okay. Chapter 4 and chapter 5 are happier, which is probably good. There's a lot of hope in chapters 4 and 5. So it'll be a little bit more pleasant to go through these two chapters. So in chapter 4, verse 1, it says, "Now it shall come to pass in the latter days." What are the latter days? It's the days after the destruction. Okay, so all this bad stuff he just finished talking about, now he's going to start talking about what's going to happen after this is over with. Okay, it says, "Now it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and peoples shall flow to it." What he's talking about, so Jerusalem sits on a hill. So if you can kind of picture Israel, everything kind of flows up to Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is one of the higher places in the country, especially for the area immediately around Jerusalem. If you go to Jerusalem, you go up to Jerusalem. Okay, so what he's saying is that Jerusalem will become the top of the mountains. Okay, it shall be higher than all the other hills. Now, what is he getting at by this? Is it literal that Jerusalem will be the highest mountain, higher than all the others? Maybe, but really it's more talking spiritually, okay? So what was happening on the other hills and the other mountains in Israel and Judah at this time that God was so upset with? Well, this was where the idol worship was happening. So you had the high places where the people would do false worship and so forth. And so what he's saying is after all this tragedy happens, where Assyria is going to come in, take you captive, or later Babylon comes in and takes you captive, and all this stuff is destroyed, what he's talking about is a remnant is going to come back eventually, okay? And when they come back, all of that idol worship will be gone, and spiritually speaking, Jerusalem will be the highest mountain of all the area, okay, from a spiritual standpoint. Now, what's going to be the result of Jerusalem being spiritually the pinnacle place for people to go? Verse 2, "Many nations shall come and say," and the word nations here, this is the Hebrew word. Singular is goy, plural is goyim. You'll actually hear Jews still use this word a lot today when they're talking about anybody that's not Jewish. They'll call them the goyim. Goyim means nations, but it means non-Jews, okay? And so what he's saying is that a lot of non-Jews are going to flock to this area for a particular reason, okay? So why would all these non-Jews want to come to this spiritual mountain, and what is it they're hoping to gain? Okay, so verse 2, many nations shall come and say, come and let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. Why? Are they going there to offer sacrifices? What are they going there to do? It says, he will teach us his ways, and we shall walk in his paths. So when it says he'll teach us his ways and we'll walk in his paths, ways and paths means a way of living, a way of life, a code of ethics, whatever expression you want to use. But what it's saying is these nations are going to flock there to learn about God and to learn what God wants from them and what God expects, okay? So then it says, for out of Zion the law shall go forth, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So God's instructions to mankind are going to flow from Jerusalem out to the rest of the world, okay? Now, did this ever happen? Okay, so this sounds a whole lot like Acts chapter 2, right? And so this is a foretelling of what's going to happen in the future. All right, verse 3, it says, he shall judge between many peoples. Again, the word peoples there is probably referring to all the nations. And rebuke strong nations afar off. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And so what he's portraying here is a time of peace, okay? So something is going to happen in the future. Basically, he's going to elaborate on this a little bit more in a minute, but what he's talking about is after this period of captivity, there's going to be a remnant of Jews that return. And when they return, at some point, Jerusalem will become a spiritual mountaintop from which God's message to all humanity will spread forth. And once that message spreads forth, then there will be a time of peace, hopefully, where people can put away all their instruments of war and use those tools for war for a different purpose, okay? So what he's portraying is hope for the future, that the future will be brighter than the current situation that they're currently in. Okay, so this is all a prophecy for a future event, most likely referring to what we see in Acts chapter 2. Okay, so verse 4, these are some other things that will happen at this time. But everyone shall sit under his vine and under his fig tree, and that's just sitting under a vine and sitting under a fig tree is an expression or an idiom for peace. It means that you have a peaceful existence, that you can kind of leisurely sit under your fig tree and hang out or meditate or read or whatever. And this same expression was used in Joel. We saw it when we talked about Joel. And it says, and no one shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. So in other words, God is going to see to it that these things come to pass. All right, verse 5, for all people walk each in the name of his God, but we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. And so what does he mean by that? You can take that as two different things. You can take that meaning that God's remnant people, which if you're equating this to Acts chapter 2, the remnant would be the collection of Jews at that particular time that will obey God's commands and become part of the church. So he may be referring to that and saying that at that time, then that remnant will only worship God, whereas the rest of the world will worship whatever God they want to worship. If you're thinking that this is maybe a time before Acts chapter 2, then you would just view it as the remnant Jews are being faithful to God while the rest of the world is doing their pagan thing. You can kind of view it as either, but it does seem to kind of make a little more sense as looking at this as a future portraying of the events of Acts chapter 2 and so forth. Okay, verse 6, it says, "In that day, says the Lord," and again, that day is the future time that he's talking about. What is he going to do? He's going to give several things that he's going to do, but what you'll notice is this is imagery of sheep. So he's giving this metaphor of he's going to be a shepherd for his people, and his people are going to be like sheep for him. So he says, "I will assemble the lame, I will gather the outcast, and those whom I have afflicted. I will make the lame a remnant, and the outcast a strong nation. So the Lord will reign over them in Mount Zion from now on, even forever." So he's saying that he's going to have a remnant of people, and he's going to reign over that remnant of people. He's going to gather them together to himself, and he's going to take care of them just like a shepherd would take care of sheep. Okay, so all this is looking to a future point, but it's giving hope to the people. So you can imagine, Micah's not a popular guy. Okay, his message is not going to be too popular. Most people are probably not going to listen to what he has to say. But if you are listening to what he has to say, what you realize is this is a very terrible time, right? Your country's about to fall or be invaded by Assyria, and you may be taken into captivity in Assyria if you believe the messages Micah's giving. But now Micah's offering some hope that, okay, beyond the terrible things that are going to happen, there is a brighter day on the horizon beyond that, okay? And so that's Micah's trying to offer some hope to the people. Verse 8, it says, "And you, O tower of the flock, the stronghold of the daughter of Zion, to you shall it come, even the former dominion shall come, the kingdom of the daughter of Jerusalem." So again, it's this idea that God will reign over his people. He uses some terminology that you would associate with a kingdom, like dominion and so forth, kingdom, etc. And so the idea is that God is going to gather a remnant of people, and they will become his nation, and he will protect them. Now, the happiness is going to stop for 2 verses, and he's going to revert back and talk about negative stuff for 2 verses, and then he's going to come back around to positive stuff again. Okay, so what we have so far is that he's made a prophecy about a future time when there will be a remnant of people God's message will spread forth to the world from Jerusalem, and a remnant of people God will protect and call them his own people, and he will be their shepherd. Okay, verse 9 and 10, he diverts back for a second to the more negative message. It says, "Now why do you cry aloud? Is there no king in your midst? Has your counselor perished? For pangs have seized you like a woman in labor." And what he's doing here is he's kind of mocking them. When he says, "Now why do you cry aloud? Is there no king in your midst?" Well, they have a king, okay? So it's one of 3 kings at this time. It's either Jotham, Ahaz, or Hezekiah, depending on when he's making these prophecies. But the point he's making is, you have a king, but your leadership has failed you, okay? And so you're in the situation you're in because of bad leadership. And because of bad leadership, you're going to reap what your leadership has sown, which means this country is going to be invaded by Assyria. Later down the road, they'll be invaded by Babylon. They'll eventually some of them will go into captivity to Assyria. A lot of them will go into captivity to Babylon later. But the point is you have bad leadership. Now, Hezekiah was an exception. He was a better leader. So when you look at chapters 2 and 3, when he hits the 3 categories of the wealthy, the leaders, and the false prophets, he never actually says the king is bad, okay? And that leads some people to think that maybe he made those prophecies during Hezekiah's reign, and he didn't direct it exactly at Hezekiah because Hezekiah was trying to do positive things, but the other leadership may have been bad. But that's just a bit of a guess, okay? But the idea is, you're in the situation you're in because of bad leadership. So what's going to happen to them? The last line of verse 9 and then verse 10, it says, "For pangs have seized you like a woman in labor. Be in pain and labor to bring forth, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in birth pangs." So what he's describing is the catastrophe that is about to happen to you. He's comparing it or using the metaphor of a woman in labor, okay? So in other words, it's going to be a very difficult time, but on the other end of it, using the labor metaphor, once the child is delivered, then you kind of forget about the labor part. But for right now, they're in the midst of the labor part. So he's saying, you're in the midst of disaster. It's going to be bad for a while, and you're going to have to endure it. So if you keep going, the fourth line in verse 10, "For now you shall go forth from the city." That phrase saying go forth from the city, that means you're going to have to leave the city and surrender. Okay, so when Assyria comes in, you're going to be overthrown. You're going to have to leave Jerusalem with your tail between your legs and walk out and submit to your captors. And then he says, "You shall dwell in the field." And what that means is, when they left Jerusalem and went outside the city, Assyria is going to arrange them into groups to carry them into captivity, okay? So that's what they're going to be doing when they're out in the field. They're going to be arranged into different categories to go into captivity. And then he says, "And to Babylon you shall go." Now, this causes some people trouble because he mentions Babylon here. Who is the world power at this time? It's Assyria, okay? So why is he talking about Babylon? Because Babylon doesn't hit the scene until later on. And so some people who like to criticize the Bible, they're like, oh, we'll see, this was added after the fact. This isn't actually part of the original text, blah, 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 blah. But if you remember from the introduction that I showed you, Assyria and Babylon, they're both part of modern-day Iraq. Assyria is in the north, Babylon is in the south, okay? But throughout their history, they usually function as one country, even though they're technically two. And what do I mean by that? Usually, one of them is the greater power than the other and rules the other, okay? So at this particular time we're talking about, Assyria is the stronger of the two, so Assyria controls Babylon. So Babylon is a vassal state of Assyria. But what's going to happen later on is Babylon is going to get strong enough to defeat Assyria, and so then Babylon will become the main power and Assyria will be assimilated into Babylon. But they kind of go back and forth typically through history as to which one is ruling which. And at this particular time, if you remember from the introduction, when Hezekiah is king, the king of Babylon sends an envoy to Israel, to Judah, to meet Hezekiah to try to talk him into a military alliance to fight against Assyria. Okay, so Babylon is starting to rise up at this point. Now, the other thing is, in 722, when Assyria defeats Israel and they take all the captives from Israel into Assyria, they do take a lot of them to Babylon, okay? So Assyria controls Babylon, so they take some of the captives to Babylon. So it's not out of place for Micah to predict or prophesy that even though Assyria is the main country, that the captives might actually go to Babylon, because Babylon is it's controlled by Assyria at this time. It's a vassal state of Assyria. So I know I said a lot that you probably don't care about, but the point is that this statement does not make it historically inaccurate, okay, is what I'm trying to get at. All right. So he's saying you may go to Babylon, and then it says, there you shall be delivered. So here comes the hope again. There you shall be delivered. So you're going to go into captivity, but after a period of time in captivity, you will be delivered. There the Lord will redeem you from the hand of your enemies. Okay. Now he goes back to some negative stuff. Verse 11, now also many nations have gathered against you. Now, at this point, how many nations are really gathered against them? Well, off and on, it's a lot of them, but at this point, the major problem is Assyria. So why does he say many nations? Well, Assyria's army is actually made up of many nations, okay? So if you remember, Assyria conquers all these other countries and takes them over. So their military is not purely just Assyrians. Their military is a conglomerate of captured people plus Assyrians. So when their military comes in, it's going to be a mixed group of people from different countries. And so it says, verse 11, now also many nations have gathered against you, which in reality is Assyria's army, but Assyria's army is multi-nationality. And it says, who say, this is what they'll say when they come, let her be defiled, and let our eye look upon Zion. So when it says let her be defiled, that means let them be conquered. So they're going to come in, they're going to conquer Jerusalem, and they're going to look on Zion, but they're going to look on Zion with mockery, I guess you would say. So they want to see Jerusalem fall, and they're going to laugh when Jerusalem falls. And so that's their goal, is to come in, take over the country, and laugh and mock them as they do it. All right, verse 12. But what is the ramification for Assyria? So remember, who's the real enemy of the people? Well, the real enemy is themselves, one, but because they've broken the covenant, God has become their enemy, okay? So Assyria is not really the main enemy. Assyria is just a tool that God is using to punish them, okay? But like any tool, it can sometimes get out of hand and do its own thing. And so verse 12, it says, but they meaning Assyria does not know the thoughts of the Lord. In other words, Assyria doesn't realize that they're just a puppet in God's hand. And so it says, nor does Assyria understand his counsel. So he's making the point that, yes, Assyria is going to come in, they're going to defeat you, they're going to cause a lot of chaos, but they're doing so because God is behind the scenes pushing them to do it. And God's doing that to punish you, okay? But in the process, Assyria has no idea this is part of God's plan, and they can continue to act independently, and they don't understand the ramifications of their actions, okay? So what will happen to them as a result of them going above and beyond what God really wants them to do, okay? It says, for he will gather them like sheaves to the threshing floor. So in other words, God intended them to punish his people, but he also knew that they were going to go further with it than what God really wants. And as a result, they're going to sin against God. And so because they sin against God, God then in turn has to punish them too, okay? But Assyria doesn't know any of this because Assyria does not worship Yahweh. Assyria worships multiple other gods who are obviously false gods, okay? One of which is the god Sin, spelled S-I-N, but pronounced S-E-E-N in English, from which the name Sennacherib comes. Okay, so the first three letters of Sennacherib's name is a deity from Assyria, Sin. That's where his name comes from. Okay, and then when you get to Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar's name, the first part of Nebuchadnezzar, Nabu, is also a name of a Babylonian god. I think Nebuchadnezzar, if I remember right, means Nabu, protect this gate or city or something like that. And Sennacherib is like, I'd have to look it up. It has something to do with seeing, protecting something. Anyway, it's interesting because you got an Assyrian king and then a Babylonian king with names to their deities warring against kings of Israel and Judah who have names for their deity. And it's like you've got these two deities clashing with each other, and which deity is going to win. And so right now it kind of looks like Sennacherib is going to win, which is the god Sin from Assyria. But Yahweh is saying that's not really what's going to happen. They're going to get theirs eventually. All right, so verse 13, it says, arise and thresh. This is a command. It's one of the few times where a prophet gives a military command to rise up and do something. So it says, arise and thresh, O daughter of Zion, for I will make your horn iron. So an iron horn at that time was considered unbreakable. And so this would be a weapon that Assyria could not stand up against. And then it says, and I will make your hooves bronze. So these are two military weapons that were considered basically undefeatable. And then it says, you shall beat in pieces many people. I will consecrate their gain to the Lord and their substance to the Lord of the whole earth. Okay, so what he's basically saying is, Assyria is going to be punished for what Assyria does. Okay. Now, does their punishment actually happen by Judah and Israel? No, it's Babylon, who will come in to defeat them later. But as a result, it says, "I will consecrate their gain to the Lord." And what does that mean? The word "consecrate" you may see in another translation. Let me see what the ESV has. Yeah, devote, which probably makes more sense. So this is the word for devote, or consecrate's okay. But you see this in Joshua a lot. So when the people entered the promised land, if you remember, as they went to different cities and destroyed different things, God would tell them, don't take any of the spoils of victory. All of this belongs to me, okay? And so that's what's called the ban. You'll hear that term. And that means that they were supposed to go in, kill everything. They weren't supposed to take any of the livestock, etc. But they sometimes would not do that, and when they wouldn't do it, God would punish them. And if you remember when Saul, I forget who he attacked, but he had a military victory, and he decided to save all of the animals. And when Samuel shows up, and I'm paraphrasing, but he basically says, "What's all this sheep I hear?" Okay. And Saul makes up this excuse, "Oh, the people talked me into it. We're just going to offer all this to God. We thought that'd be a great thing." And he's like, "No." And that's when God withdrew from Saul and decided that Saul would no longer be king. All that stuff is supposed to be given to God as part of what's called the ban, okay? And that's what he's referring to in this line where it says, "I will consecrate their gain to the Lord." It means all of the ill-gotten gains that Assyria got by oppressing people, conquering all these lands and so forth, they would not keep that wealth. It would all go back to God. But it also means the wealth would not go to Judah and Israel. Okay, so his people aren't going to get it. It's all going to go back to God. And then it says the last line, And there's substance to the Lord of the whole earth, meaning that stuff's going to be dedicated to God. But this is also maybe a slight mockery of Sennacherib, okay? So Sennacherib boasted that he was the, quote, king of the world, okay? That was a title he gave for himself. And if you notice here, so Sennacherib is the king of Assyria that's going to come in, take over 200,000 Judeans prisoner, and get stopped just short of Jerusalem when God comes in with the angel of the Lord and kills his entire army. And so Sennacherib claims to be the king of the world, but God says in this last line of verse 13 that he is the Lord of the whole earth. Okay, and so Sennacherib makes a false claim that like he's some great special person, when in reality God is the one in control of everything. Okay. Now the next line, which is the first line of chapter 5 verse 1, actually in the Hebrew Bible goes into chapter 4, and some English Bibles do that, but a lot of them stick it in chapter 5. So I'll go ahead and cover it as part of chapter 4 real quick because it really goes with chapter 4. So it says, "Now gather yourself in troops, O daughter of troops." That doesn't make sense. And then it says, "He has laid siege against us. They will strike the judge of Israel with the rod of the cheek." So the first part where it says, "Now gather yourself in troops," that part really goes with chapter 4, where it's the call, where Micah is calling the people to, in the future, they're going to rise up against Assyria. So that ends chapter 4. So chapter 4 has a lot of hope, a lot of message for a positive future. Does anybody have any questions on 4? Okay. We got a couple minutes. I may hit a couple of verses of 5 real quick. So chapter 4, we probably won't finish this, but these first 2 or 3 verses of 5 are very famous. They're quoted elsewhere. So if you pick up in the second line of verse 1, it says, "O daughter of troops, he has laid siege against us," meaning Sennacherib is going to come in. King of Assyria is going to come in. He's going to lay siege against the city. It says, "They will strike the judge of Israel with a rod on the cheek," meaning they're going to strike the king on the cheek with a rod. And that's a symbol of humiliation when you do that. So he's saying they're going to come in, they're going to lay siege to the city, they're going to insult the king. But what's going to happen as a result of that? And it's the next verse that is very famous, and this is quoted in Matthew chapter 2. But this also, let's take a bell. We'll just pick up there next week. All right, so we'll start there. I think I totally botched something, though. Let me just look at something real quick. There was one important point I think I forgot to make. Yeah, so sorry, just real quick. So I forgot to tell you that the first 3 verses of Micah chapter 4, I forgot to say this. So verses 1, 2, and 3 of Micah 4 are identical to Isaiah chapter 2, verses 2 through 4, okay? And so it's basically word for word. There might be one word difference, but they're basically an exact quote of each other. Now, now remember, these 2 prophets overlap. And so it's really impossible to know, is this something Micah said and Isaiah quoted, or Isaiah said it and Micah quoted, or they both found it from a completely third independent source. That I'm not sure. But both of the prophets used that exact language about a hope for a future. And those 3 verses are identical in both books. So I'll stop there. Does anybody have any questions? Okay.